It's really through Emily that we learned what sort of Dylan had gone through, and it sounded so surreal to them all, because she said he had a black mask and he looked like he was carrying a black vacuum. And
yesterday we spoke about why the psychopath label doesn't work. It's because it removes any and all interiority from our perpetrator. But why is that a problem?
You cannot have a protagonist without desire. It doesn't make any sense. Any fucking sense. You follow?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now I want to draw your attention to this article published in the Daily Beast just a couple of days ago, July 8th. Kohberger leaves motive for killings a mystery in signed confession. And then he goes on to also write, the world may never know. Bryan Kohberger's written confession offered no clues as to why he committed the grisly slayings. Now, to me it's completely the opposite. Bryan Kohberger's written confession offers several clues as to why he committed the grisly slayings. And so the whole article is basically this whole apologia on why you can't know Kohberger's motive. A quote reads, Kohberger's signed confession leaves his motives a complete mystery. Wow. So if a killer doesn't tell you why he committed a crime, we will never know? Really?
Are you out of your fucking mind?
Haven't you ever second-guessed your own motives for wanting to be in a relationship with someone? Or why you working for a particular company? And hasn't anyone ever done the same to you? Haven't you ever asked yourself, why are you doing something? Well then, you aren't a complete amateur at motives. After all, criminal psychology, although different to ordinary psychology, is nevertheless an offshoot of it. We are not born criminals. We are not born with a criminal psychology. We become criminals, or we can become criminals based on a host of factors, yes. A psychological predisposition, yes. Cultural and environmental factors, maybe. But prime amongst these is how we respond to real life's slings and arrows. At the end of a long road of circumstances, when asked whether we want to cross that line between good and evil, we always have the power not to do so, the power and the responsibility. We have the responsibility to act or not to act. We have the responsibility to resist certain responses from a whole host of alternatives. Or we can give in to them and experience our world unraveling, but then no one is to blame except us. No matter how bad our upbringing or how triggered we are by trauma, we can always choose adaptive responses that make sense, rather than maladaptive ones. The choice is ours. And what is maladaptive?
Maladaptive.
Maladaptive is not adjusting adequately or not adapting properly or appropriately to the environment or situation. What is a classic way of maladaptiveness? Well, being addicted to something, taking drugs, drinking a lot, eating too much. The thing that clouds this process in terms of how we choose, how we respond to the stresses around us, the thing that makes what ought to be a clear cerebral situation somewhat unclear, are our emotions, our feelings. And not only that, a skewed sense of self. Someone once said there are two wolves inside each of us. The one who wins depends on the one that you feed. A very important predictor of criminals' propensity is whether one's sense of self is derived from others or via an important process called individuation.
Individuation.
Individuation is a principle of how one thing is distinct from another thing, including you, including an individual. How do you make yourself different, or are you different from somebody else? Are you aware of those differences? Are others aware of them? Sometimes we can be distinct from others in a good way. Sometimes we can be distinct from others in a way where people just don't understand and they say, wow, he's creepy. Part of this process, or another part of it, is also developing not only our identity in terms of ourselves, but also our social identity, who we decide and where we decide we fit into society, which is to some extent a contract. Society also decides where we should fit in. Is that a mutually accepted contract, or is it one-sided? Now, you can have social identity that is negative, which requires confirmation by others. It can be difficult for awkward children, and there's the potential for depression. And then you can also have positive social identity, which can shape self-image in a powerful way. You can have a sense of belonging with that, and it can lead to a sense of community in terms of a group that want you to be part of it. So clearly, one way to resist not just criminal impulses, but ordinary bad habits is by developing a strong sense of self, a clear and unshakable sense of who we are, of our identity. And this helps us to explain to ourselves why we are making the choices and the constant set of decisions, big and small, that lead to a successful life, or indeed a dysfunctional one. One of the real symptoms of someone who's going down a path, potentially towards criminality, is where the individual becomes increasingly isolated and at odds with society. In a social situation, people around a particular individual can see that something is wrong. They can take care of that person. They can help that person recover from whatever situation they're in, and perhaps go off a path that they're starting to go on. Whereas if someone is isolated enough, they are unglued from society, and there's nothing eventually stopping them, or it seems that way, from going down a particular course of action. Well, there's nothing to stop them except themselves. And have they got the sense of identity to do so? Well, often when people are unstuck from society, they do not. And that's the reason they are unstuck from society to begin with, because they have no sense of identity. So how can one develop a strong sense of identity? Well, prioritize self-reflection. Try to develop self-awareness. Embrace individuality. Build positive relationships, work on making friends, engage in activities that promote self-discovery and personal growth. Instead of playing computer games and taking drugs, go outside and do things like adding regular exercise, even if it's simply walking your dog. Questions to ask when you're in an identity crisis: what are my values? What am I passionate about? What do I care about? Who do I envy? What do I believe? What role do I have in society? Do I like having that role? Can I think of a role that I want, and can I fulfill it? What do I feel like my purpose is? How do I relate to people? Do I like how I act around them? How do I need to change? Who do I want to be in 5 years or 10 years? Now, to come back to that Daily Beast article, and I'll put a link to it in the description. As I said, it's very apathetic. It makes no effort to try and solve the motive. One paragraph of the article reads, Bryan's confession document doesn't reveal any new information beyond what Kohberger admitted to at his change of plea hearing last Wednesday. Now, what this article reveals is how criminal psychology is an art, and just how few are able to interpret the signs and signals accurately. The writer clearly has written an article about why trying to fathom motive is pointless. Well, it's not. It is not pointless to try and figure out criminal psychology, and motive is not unfathomable.
Far from it.
Just in this one article, which is all about how unknowable Kohberger's motives are, it turns out much is revealed, arguably all we need to know. So how about we take a look and see how good we are at interpreting the signs? And there are quite a few. There are about 6 of them. Right? 6 obvious signs based on what we already know. But before we deal with the next section, exciting news, we're going to be dealing with a hypothetical motive in the Air India case. If you haven't watched any videos on that, watch the next one, where we will deal with this idea: if a pilot was responsible and intentionally crashed Flight 171, then what was his motive? What is the motive when it comes to mass murder? And then the question for you guys is, does Kohberger share any of the same criminal psychopathology? And you might find the answer to that quite chilling. Meanwhile, if you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please subscribe. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Number 1, premeditation equals fantasy. Fantasy equals loneliness. That's another way of saying, the premeditation in this case came about after fantasizing repeatedly about getting a certain kind of revenge. Where did that come from? Well, loneliness. And be careful to what extent you're preoccupied with fantasies, because many fantasies are born out of loneliness. People who aren't lonely don't really need to fantasize. Kohberger's crime, let's be very clear, is particularly cruel and sadistic. Well, it was meant to be. The sadism is linked to an area of his life where he is not alive, but rather caught up in a very rigid, death-like life. His strict veganism is one example. If he was playing a lot of computer games, that is another example. Sadism is also linked to anality, drugs, and hypothetical living, not actual living. And so what Kohberger lacks, is the experience of life. In other words, if you think about what's going on with these other students in the funhouse, all of that, the laughter, the enjoyment, the time together, and yes, the sex as well. And what is more authentic and raw and exhilarating than the sexual experience? If you're a lonely person, what is the polar opposite to that? Well, he wants the experience of life, and he sees it while stalking, while driving around, but also he sees he can't have it. He experiences this deprivation as painful, perhaps excruciatingly painful, and he responds to it maladaptively. He wants others to feel the pain that he's feeling. He doesn't think it's fair. But he also probably responds to it by watching pornography and fantasizing excessively, and then graduating to murder. He doesn't adaptively solve the problem because he feels he lacks the personal agency to do so. Well, whose fault is that? And so when the writer of this article talks about the crime that he's guilty of is acting with deliberation, with premeditation and malice, that tells you already a lot about the person that we're dealing with, his criminal psychology. Number 2, signature reveals struggles with his identity. And so he writes there, signed his name in a slightly misshapen cursive writing. The Daily Beast writer, in spite of giving up on trying to figure out the motive, nevertheless accurately perceives a thing or two about this case, such as Kohberger's signature. Have a look at it. He correctly describes it as slightly misshapen cursive writing. I would simply say it appears a little garbled. His signature is as confused as he is. This is unsurprising because in the time when he was supposed to become someone, supposed to individuate, supposed to discover and explore his own personal power, he was doing the opposite. He was taking drugs. He was also being bullied by his peers, and his response was to cower, to hide away from the world, and also to soothe the trauma with feel-good drugs. Number 3, erratic. Now, if we compare the two signatures, we see they are different. They're inconsistent. This indicates a changing sense of self and erratic nature. Have a look at the C where he writes Bryan C. Kohberger. Look at the C. It's got a little line going to the top and a little line underneath. He's gone to a lot of effort to stipulate who he is. But then also look at those strange little circles next to Kohberger and how the B in burger is very small. And look how strange the R is. The strange almost looks like the letter N. If you look at the second last letter E and the final letter E, look how the one letter E is tiny and sort of floating in the middle of nowhere. The other one is much bigger and sharper and sort of higher up in the air. Now let's compare that signature to another signature.
Closer, please. Closer.
And that brings us to number 4, impulsive. Do you see the impulsiveness in the signature? Do you see that it's borne out in the impulsiveness of the drug addict, which in turn is reflected in the impulsivity of the crime scene? He not only kills impulsively and compulsively, he steals something. He steals something impulsively from the scene as well. That's also in this Daily Beast article. He also pleaded guilty to a count of burglary. That's kind of unusual, where someone kills in a way like this and then also steals something. Number 5, addictive compulsive. From drugs to obsessing over the opposite sex, it's this addictive compulsivity that leads to him choosing to feed one wolf after another. This is the key to his psychology, and soon he eventually becomes this wolf. This is also how his identity shifts from ordinary psychology to criminal psychology. Number 6, he has not learned self-discipline. Well, anyone who's addicted doesn't have self-discipline. And that is another reason why exercise is such a useful way to develop a sense of self, a sense of identity, because it helps us to master our emotions, to develop personal boundaries and self-discipline. I'm going to get up, I'm going to exercise even though I don't really want to. I'm going to master my body. I'm going to direct my body to get up and to move and to be uncomfortable and put in an effort even when I don't feel like it. And all of this gives us character and makes us stronger, dealing with the, so in other words, we prescribe difficulty and stresses and overcome them. That's what exercise is. And that trains us to deal with the sort of random stresses and strains of life. Does that make sense? Now, we know that Kohberger liked the self-discipline and the sort of rigidity, the order of a sort of military setting, where there's a rank. We know that he always wanted to be an army ranger when he was at school, and also that he applied to be a cop. We know that he was a security guard. I think it was one of his first jobs out of school. Why? Because he likes the order and ranking system of these professions. Why? Because in his personal life, it feels like he doesn't know where he belongs, so he wants to be told where he belongs. He wants that to be made explicit, because he can't make it explicit through his lack of personal agency, right? And so he needs the social rank to be made explicit, whereas in his own life, he has little control and he's struggling to find his way onto the social hierarchy. He also buys a military-grade knife that's also in the article as a way to assert his masculinity. The article also notes there's no evidence, at least in the public record, that Kohberger ever met any of his 4 victims, although prosecutors did gather cell phone evidence showing that Kohberger had driven past the victim's house several times. No evidence doesn't mean he didn't know the victims. A visit to the actual house, as I did, proves just how open one can become with its occupants, even standing on the parking lot right outside. It literally feels that you can simply reach out with your hands and you can almost touch Maddie's window, which is the window closest to the road. You can see right in there, you can hear what is going on. I've always felt that the fish glittering in the white trays where Kohberger did his summer job, that reminds me of the glimpses he might have had of girls flashing for a moment in front of the large bedroom windows. And then this final excerpt from the Daily Beast. Bill Thompson said that he would not represent that he intended to commit all of the murders that he did that night, to argue that Kohberger only intended to kill some of his 4 eventual victims. An obsession with Mogan, lingering trauma from childhood, and an affinity for the incel movement have all been floated by commentators. But only Kohberger knows the truth, and it could stay that way. And I guess the question is, will he read out some sort of manifesto next week at the sentencing hearing? Who knows? He might apologize. He took the plea deal, and this shows that he had a change of heart from whatever drove him at the time to commit quadruple murder. I don't think he intended to commit the quadruple murder, and perhaps he does feel genuine remorse, at least over that part. I said previously that motive is hard and it requires us to really know someone, really know the who. Has anyone pondered Kohberger's true motive for taking the plea deal? I mean, aside from saving his own hide from an Idaho firing squad, anyone thought about that? Why did he really take the plea deal? Well, isn't it because of his sisters? And look at his sisters. They are functional and non-criminals. Why? Why are they functional and not him? Well, it's down to their sense of personal identity and the choices they made as youngsters. And I really do believe one of the reasons he took the plea deal is because his sisters were both fired from their jobs, not for any reason other than that I guess they are related to Kohberger. They need this negative publicity to go away because this negative publicity follows them into the workplace. And so who knows, the difference between them, Kohberger's sisters, and Kohberger is possibly also the environment was a little different. I doubt whether they were bullied in the same way Kohberger was. But even if they'd responded in a different way, instead of taking drugs and playing computer games, well, your life would be a lot different. So when it comes to motive, we need to do just one thing to be better true crime rocket scientists.
Try harder.
Do you think you can? Do you want to try harder? Well, if you do try harder at getting to know the who, and you can start by avoiding using labels. I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.